Hey Earthkeepers. In this episode, James and I have a conversation with John Philip Newell about his new book, The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Search for Healing and Home. In this book, John Philip argues for a reimagining of how we relate to creation, to each other, to God, and even to ourselves. He advocates for engaging creation as the primary means of knowing God, of seeing the sacred in all life forms, and of loving all creation as we love ourselves. Now, because our conversation was so full of emerging truths and insights, we split it into 2 episodes. Here then is part 1 of our conversation with John Philip Newell.
Welcome to the podcast, John Philip. It's really an honor to have you with us and spend some time in conversation with you. And Forrest and I are really eager to talk with you about your new book, The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Quest for Healing and Home. And before we jump into that, though, I wonder if you could orient our listeners a little bit to the work that you do and what's animating you most these days.
Thank you, James. Very good to be with you. I'm up here in the Findhorn community in Scotland. I'm part of the eco-village of Findhorn. And part of what I'm focusing on at the moment is the details of moving from Edinburgh to the Findhorn community. It's great to be here in a sort of eco-spiritual community that began about 60 years ago and way ahead of the game in terms of earth consciousness and recognizing that there's a type of consciousness in all matter, inviting us into relationship with Earth and with Earth's life forms, and not just sort of using Earth or objectifying Earth, but seeing ourselves in an I-thou relationship with everything that has being. So it's great to be here. My sort of deep roots in terms of spirituality, and much of my teaching and writing over the years has been in the Celtic lineage of wisdom that stretches in the Christian era really from about the 2nd century right through to today. And although this has been my home address, as it were, spiritually for a long time, I think I'm feeling even more these days the urgency of accessing some of these ancient ways of seeing in relation to Earth and trying to offer that in the human context today. The urgency with which we need true relationship with Earth and true relationship with one another, both as individuals and collectively as nations, is feeling even more urgent than ever, to recover strands of wisdom from the past that can help in the healing process of Earth and humanity's relationship with Earth and with one another. So that's very much the focus and passion of my life.
You know, John Philip, in the early days of my exploration into what an ecology-focused community could look like, I actually did a pilgrimage to Findhorn just to find out the different things that people were trying and thinking and ways of being together. And I have to say, the one house that I will never forget is the house made out of a giant whiskey barrel.
Yes, well, this is very much whiskey territory in Scotland. Many of the great distilleries like Glenfiddich and so on are fairly close to us. Recycled whiskey barrels have been used in relation to building. And there's also a local chap who makes use of old whiskey barrels. He cuts them up, and they're great for our wood-burning stoves and so on, because they continue to have a bit of whiskey or alcohol in them, which makes them produce a very intense and fast heat.
Well, James and I were talking about the way that you framed your book, The Great Search. And as an ethnographer by training, I was completely engaged by your stylistic choice to focus each chapter on the life of a wise figure, as you put it. And so you focus on historical figures like Jung or Rumi or Edwin Muir. But perhaps you could tell us about that choice. I'm curious, that choice to let new ideas emerge from stories rather than leading with the ideas themselves.
For some years, I've been very aware of this being a moment of religious exile for so many. I would say millions of our brothers and sisters, even if we're just speaking about the Christian household, let alone other religious traditions. But millions of our brothers and sisters who began life very much within the four walls of their religious inheritance are no longer there. And one of the things that I've been keen to do is to be in relationship with that diaspora or exile and ask, well, what are we yearning for, and why are we not finding it within the traditional teachings of religion as we've known it, and what are the deep yearnings of the human soul at this moment in time? In the introduction to the book, I quote the young Jewish philosopher and writer Simone Weil, who managed to escape from Paris just before the Nazi invasion of her homeland, but then died tragically before the end of the war. But Simone uses a phrase that has been important to me in the writing of this book and reflection. She speaks of the efficacy of desire, the efficacy of desire. And by that, I believe she means that getting in touch with the deepest yearnings of our being is efficacious. That is, it helps bring about what we're deeply longing for. It translates those stirrings in our soul into greater consciousness. And from greater consciousness and awareness, we can more readily translate those yearnings into an embodiment of how we live, how we choose to interrelate, how we see one another and all things. So the book is really shaped by paying attention to what I believe are 9 great yearnings in the human soul today, and asking how do we address those, and how do we nurture them to allow for new beginnings, because I think we're in a transition age as so many older systems of authority and religious belief are collapsing. So that in a sense is the big story, and it relates to the little story that is my story. So it's not a book about me, but my own journey is parallel to or consistent with this time of religious exile. So around the beginnings of reflecting on this book and asking what direction I should follow in the research and the writing. It was around the time that I relinquished my ordination as a minister of the church. So I've been for a long time aware of those who are in a type of exile from religion, but I'm very emphatically in exile myself now. And one of the things that's become clear to me, and I speak about relinquishing my ordination, and I was sharing my journey with a woman on Iona recently, and after I spoke for a while, she said, you gave back your ordination. And I think that's maybe a better phrase than relinquish. In the sense, it was a sense of giving it back. It doesn't fit the focus of so much of my teaching around sacredness of earth and sacredness at the heart of every human being. There's a type of disconnect between what I'm teaching and the sort of foundational creeds and doctrines that have been deep in the history of Western Christianity, especially as it unfolded from the 4th century onwards, when Christianity got into bed with empire. And so the decision to give back my ordination was an important transition point in my own life. Since that decision, I've become very aware of a type of tension, a creative tension that is deep in our Judeo-Christian inheritance, and we find it in our scriptures. And that is a type of creative tension between the prophetic and the priestly, or between the wilderness and the temple. So I see myself as primarily really in the wilderness now, trying to lend my voice to a much bigger prophetic voice that's calling for change, that's calling for new beginnings, new birthings. And I believe very much that we need one another. The wilderness and the temple need not be torn apart, in a sense. I think we need voices from the edge. So many of my good friends are still priests or ministers within the temple, as it were, and I respect what they're doing, and we need one another at this moment in time, because we're not just talking about the future of religion, we're really speaking about the future of the world. And if humanity doesn't enter a new beginning in terms of sacredness of earth and sacredness of every human being, then it's doubtful whether there will be a future for humanity as we've known it. So there's that feeling of urgency, and there's the feeling that these 9 great teachers, I think, can feed some of the deep yearnings of this moment.
John Philip, I want to follow up with this with some questions and maybe some advice about exile and those who find themselves feeling in a similar place. In many ways, the organization that Forrest and I help lead, Circlewood, which is Behind the Earth Keepers podcast, we often describe ourselves as having one foot in the church and one foot out. To use your language, maybe one foot in the temple and one foot in the wilderness. And that's a creative and tricky place to be. And for now, it's the place we feel like we can be the most helpful, and that's where our particular vocation is. We talk a lot with people who are somewhere in that journey of feeling dissatisfied or disillusioned, disconnected, struggling to find their place in exile. So I'm wondering, as you talk with people who are on that same journey, how do you help them discover their particular place in exile?
A fine way of putting it, sort of one foot in the wilderness and one foot in the temple. And I think that is very much what our scriptural tradition points to. And in many ways, it's quite amazing that the prophetic voice was given so much place in our scriptures, in that the canon of scripture was quite defined in a sense by those in the temple. So one of the things that I'm very emphatic about is that the prophetic voice, or the prophetic search out in the wilderness more, the prophetic charism or calling must, I believe, be based on love. It's not just a sounding off in the wilderness. It's not just criticizing what's happening in the temple or within the 4 walls. If it is just sort of sounding off, rather than truly speaking and being motivated by love for the family from which it has come, because I will always be grateful for being a son of the Christian household and standing in the Jesus tradition. So anything that I say or write from the wilderness, I believe, needs to be guided by love. And if I can't speak and act from love, then it's better not to be speaking. And that's what I would invite us all into, whether we find ourselves primarily in the wilderness or primarily in the temple. And you're right to say that there's a whole sort of a variety of places within that tension. And I'm, of course, sometimes misunderstood for having given back my ordination. Sometimes people within the temple, as it were, say, well, I don't think we should invite him to be speaking. He'll be telling everyone to leave the church. Of course, that's not what I would be doing, but, I understand the fear or the suspicion that that's what I might be doing. Because the reality is that there are many people still finding a deep sense of community and deep sense of vision who are also being faithful within the four walls. In my travels and my wanderings, I get to be in many Christian communities, in particular throughout the Western world, who are really fine exceptions to this moment in time. Religion as we know it may be in a state of collapse, but there are some really fine exceptions in which people are allowing a sense of new birth and deeper relationship with earth and the sacredness of every human being, not just other Christians, but people of other traditions and people of no particular religious tradition. So I think when that happens, that's wonderful. And it's a matter of each of us paying prayerful and deep attention to what is my role and what is our role at this moment in time. And I think one of the groupings within our Christian household that I've been so blessed by over the years are many of the women's religious orders within Catholicism. Many of these are wise women who are prepared to be disobedient, who are prepared to follow their convictions and their passions that the Vatican doesn't always like, and sometimes the Vatican has been trying to silence them or stop them. But one of the things I've been so struck by with many of these women's religious orders is that they realize that we have no right to perpetuity as a church, as a religious order. We have no right to perpetuity unless we are blessing humanity, unless we are blessing the world. And they're trying to do that. Many of them are turning their considerable land resources, for instance, in Ireland. Many of the women's religious orders are turning over their land to be organically farmed by young women and men in Ireland. And many of them are pursuing important inter-spiritual or interfaith relationship. They're taking the truly strong and humble stance of realizing that we have much to learn from other spiritual traditions, and are allowing some of the practices of meditation that have been more associated with the East to come right into the heart of their Christ devotion. So that's what I would sort of hope for all of us, to pay attention to where we should be positioning ourselves. Where are we feeling deeply fed? And I, for the moment, for instance, at the moment, have found a lot of spiritual strength and nourishment in the community of Findhorn, which is not an explicitly or limitedly Christian community at all, but it is an eco-spiritual community, so people come from a variety of religious backgrounds. And it's important at this moment, as I think it has been in every moment, to know that we need one another. So where are we finding community? Where are we finding simple prayer and meditation practices that really strengthen our soul and strengthen our commitment to love and to a passionate concern for justice and care for earth? So keep making sure that we are being fed and that we are in a position to be feeding one another in order to be part of the great work of transformation and healing.
I want to focus on one chapter in particular that struck me, and that was the chapter on Thomas Berry. In that chapter, you point out that religion has historically emphasized relationship between God and people and between people and people. But through Berry's story, I think you're calling really for a critical new focus. And you write, what needs to come forth now is a focus also on human-earth relations and on every species as our neighbor. Love God and love every species as yourself. This is the deep challenge of this moment in time. I find myself wanting to hear you dream a little bit. And so I want to ask you, what would be the implications if somehow some part of the church were to manage that massive reorientation to love all members of the community of creation as a central tenet of faith? I mean, what would such a church look like, and how might it impact the world?
Yeah, I love Thomas Berry, and I placed that prophetic voice in chapter 1 very intentionally. Thomas Berry was a theologian, but I love the fact that he preferred to call himself a geologian. Such was the place of the sacredness of earth in his vision. Part of the way forward for Berry that I've deeply learned from and admired is the sense that we need to reaccess what he calls the three sacred texts. And so I think a religion that really moved into loving every species as we love ourselves, such a religious or spiritual community would return to realizing that Earth itself, or the cosmos, the universe, is like a sacred text. And humanity was reading that text or accessing the text of earth and the text of the heavens long before religion came into being, and certainly long before written scripture came into being. So I think that's one of the sort of primary characteristics of a new birthing for this moment in time, to return to earth as the primary text of the sacred, to see everything as a manifestation of the divine, to see everything as having come forth from the divine. And then he recognizes the place of written scripture, and I think this is a really important part of his vision as well. And it's something that I see as an important part of committing ourselves to continued gratitude or faithfulness to our religious inheritance. And our written scriptures, of course, do primarily point to the interhuman relationship or the human-divine relationship, and not so much to the human-earth relationship. But if we are accessing Earth and the cosmos as the primary text of Revelation, then I think it's very important to hold that together with what in the Celtic traditions some of the great Celtic teachers have called the big book and the little book, the book of the universe, the book of earth, and the little book, the book of written scripture. Because, of course, part of what we hear in the little book is this strong prophetic voice calling us to be in relationship with those who are hungry, those who are homeless, those who are seeking refuge and sanctuary in our nations. So the written book of Scripture is an important text as we go forward, and it's part of our continuity with our Judeo-Christian inheritance. And then Barry points to the third text, as he calls it, and that's the inner text, the text of the human soul. And this one is particularly important for us as we move into what we don't yet know, or as we move into what has never been before. Because in the inner text of the soul, that's where we access the imagination, that's where we access intuition. And I believe these are very important in discerning the way forward. I love what Barry says when he says the universe is so amazing, it must have been dreamt into being. And then he goes on to say, prophet as he was, he goes on to say, we are in such a mess, politically, religiously, ecologically. We're in such a mess that we need to dream the way forward. We need to allow ourselves to imagine ways of being, ways of interrelating, ways of seeing, ways of celebrating, ways of praying, ways of creating religious ritual that we haven't known before. And I think one of the important things that Barry says as we discern the way forward is to remember that religion has changed considerably in the past. And it can change again. It's not as fixed as we might fear or imagine. So there have been times of great transition, and we're in a moment that is calling, I think, for an even greater change than anything we've seen in our religious history.
John Philip, I'd like to just kind of follow up on these transitions, these shifts that Barry and you are calling us to, particularly the one about elevating the place of revelation from earth and from the universe, and kind of dethroning the written scripture in terms of its absolute place in terms of our religious and spiritual knowledge and experience. In my experience, as I advocate for those kinds of shifts, I find that one, particularly for Protestants, is perhaps the most difficult one. And I'm wondering if that's your experience as well, and how you think we can help people explore that path, that transition, that shift with less fear or concern.
Yeah, a really important point, and I share your observation that it's particularly challenging within our Protestant inheritance, because the little book, written scripture, played such a significant part in the Reformation of the 16th century. But it played such an important role there that theologians in the 16th century were saying pretty extraordinary things like sola scriptura, as if we could only know God through scripture, and thus a sort of tragic forgetting of knowing God through earth. So I believe that one of the ways to make sure that people don't just feel frightened by a suggestion that there's the text of earth, the written text, and the text of the human soul, I think one of the ways of reassuring people is to celebrate just how beautiful and how powerful and how prophetic written Scripture is, and to say that we need this voice, and it's important to keep accessing that voice, because the text of earth and the text of the cosmos leads us out into very big, unbounded vision of everything in the universe as both physical and spiritual. And we need that big vision, but we don't thereby want to lose the sort of intimacy of the voice of Scripture, which again and again is addressing the interhuman relationship and the human-divine relationship. So let's be sure that as we return to a recovery of earth and the universe as sacred text, let's not see that as a diminishing of the significance of Scripture. Let's be sure that we really celebrate its prophetic voice and its guidance for how to be in true relationship with one another as human beings. And I think that's the way forward. But let's also not be frightened to bring a critique to our own Protestant inheritance and say, yeah, we sort of understand why this was happening in the 16th century. But that sola scriptura is an absurd statement. So let's be sure that we name it for the absurdity that it is to think that the divine could only be known through Scripture is such a limiting of our sense of the divine and where we will encounter the divine and where we will continue to be able to know the divine more and more deeply within ourselves and within everything in the cosmos.
We've been in conversation with John Philip Newell about his new book, The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Search for Healing and Home. For more information about John Philip, about his organization called Earth and Soul, or about other things we touched on in the conversation, please go to this episode's show notes. The Earth Keepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast, or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website, or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. James Amadon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Meggerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earth Keepers podcast.